Philosophy and spirituality. Consciousness, the first mystery. The most mysterious thing is the existence of mystery itself. More especially, in the context of even deeper mysteries. First, the mystery of existence of anything. And second, the mystery of consciousness, which is one entity that exists. And the mystery of consciousness is the first mystery because consciousness is the entity that experiences this entity called the mystery in the first place. Schools have different opinions on what consciousness is, and it remains a hard problem of both the philosophy of mind and of consciousness studies. And it's understood very differently in East and West. The Western empirical tradition of enlightenment, the journey of modernity, the empirical sciences, understand it in many very different ways than the Eastern view or the Hindu spirituality or Hindu philosophy understands consciousness. So there are very radically different views from East and West on this fundamental mystery, the first mystery. Let us look at different opinions on the subject. The first take on consciousness is that it's just a material phenomena, one more activity of matter, one more activity of brain. There's nothing special about consciousness. It's just one more movement of matter in the brain. The extreme materialist position. The second position is consciousness is an epiphenomena. It's a phenomena slightly different than other phenomena of movement of matter in the brain. So it's the first among equals, but first all the same. Epi, a special phenomena, something more than ordinary phenomena. There are two ends of this epiphenomena. On one end, some would say that this epiphenomena is epi, but still nothing different than a material phenomenon. It's a special material phenomenon. On the other end of epiphenomena would be what is the next position of emergent phenomena. That fundamental interactions of matter may be the cause of it, but what has got created is radically different. And therefore, consciousness is an emergent phenomena where what emerges out is radically different from those entities which interact, resulting in that emergence. How radically different on that? Again, you have differences of schools. On one end, the emergence of a radically new form of a material entity, or emergence of a completely new entity other than matter that we don't know of, or emergence of what we call the soul or consciousness distinct from matter. All these positions can be taken in this category of emergent phenomena. Slightly more towards the soul, we are moving from materialism to idealism, is the take of duality, that consciousness is radically different from matter, and we have two different fundamental entities interacting with each other, and therefore there is a duality. So we are no longer talking of a material phenomena, we are talking of two different entities which cannot be reduced to anything other than themselves and which have not come from one another. A strict duality. One take on the duality is that in the nature of things, it is so that this duality should come to exist. And then we go to a slightly more, duality also is a spiritual position in Hinduism. And then we can talk about a unisource duality, that matter and consciousness both come from a single source. That single source may be nature as conceptualized in that theory, or we talk of God. And then we have a sixth position of unconsciousness, not only of a unisource of both matter and consciousness, but that source being immanent across both and transcending both. And therefore, there is a movement from unisource duality to unity and immanence. Another way of approaching this problem of consciousness is to argue that even to obey law, one needs some intelligence. The obedience of law cannot happen by matter without there being an immanent intelligence in matter, and intelligence itself is a feature of consciousness, and therefore there is a consciousness immanent in matter because it obeys the laws of nature. And there has to be some consciousness to create the concept of law, not only a concept, but an entity that is executive in nature. So it needs consciousness to create the concept of law and to put it into action, and it needs consciousness to obey the law. So the creation of the law and obedience of the law are two ends, both suffused in consciousness. The obedience of law seems to be suffused in a more limited consciousness, whereas creation of the law seems to be suffused in more higher order consciousness. One more take on consciousness is the will at work in matter in the human system as well as in human history. Will in the human system and will in matter was explored by Schopenhauer, and will in human history was taken up by Hegel. This suprahuman will at work is also a cornerstone of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. Yet another way of looking at the conundrum of consciousness is to look at the concept of evolution. And there are two different ways of looking at it. Three different ways actually. One way to look at evolution is to look at as a strictly material phenomena. Second way to look at it is to look at the evolution of the spirit in Hegelian terms. Third way to look at it is to look at it as a journey of history controlled by suprahuman forces or God. And yet another way of looking at it is Sri Aurobindo's way of looking at it, of there being cycles of involution and evolution. And involution is where the pure consciousness devolves itself into matter. And from there, again, tries to evolve itself out to its real status. And that dual movement results in an outer manifestation of history of the universe and history of the planet. One more take on consciousness is that it is an entity that wants to self-actualize, and these entities get continuously created and they start moving onto the actualization path, and once they are fully actualized, they go back to some conscious realm and rest at peace there. And this is an eternal, timeless phenomenon. This is some schools of Hindu philosophy, especially the Jain school of Hindu philosophy. And then to look at consciousness as primarily being more interested in the goal of history, where individuals are more of tools, secondary entities, and the primary goal is the goal to take history to some destination. And consciousness is primarily, therefore, historical in nature. So these are various takes from philosophy, from side of philosophy, spirituality. Some have come up from a dive into epistemology, and some have come from looking at the anthropological and sociological evolution of the human race. So these are some of the takes on consciousness. So let us then go into what it is. How do we approach this mystery? Let us start with the fundamental characteristics. One way to start the study of consciousness is to talk about awareness. Some even equate the word consciousness with awareness, which is very common in psychology. That the unconscious is called unconscious and not subconscious because you are not aware of it, although in the unconscious mind, all the operations which presuppose consciousness, operations involving desire, intention, affect, cognition, all of them happen. So some equate awareness with consciousness. It's a very limited way of looking at it. Some talk of capacity to have knowledge, the capacity to know, capacity to take decision, and the capacity to go out into action or monitor action or understand from action. Some sort of participation or comprehension of action. So some define consciousness, equate consciousness only with awareness. Some say it is only ability to have knowledge. Some ability to have action, decision and action. Some put all the four together and say all the four together constitute an entity we can call consciousness. Some talk about consciousness being a power. Sri Aurobindo talks about Chit Shakti, consciousness power. He often uses the word consciousness force. So the ability to have power or to seek power. So these are some of the attributes of consciousness. Some take up one attribute, some a collection, to say this collection of attributes, if it is there, it constitutes an entity we can call consciousness. Some take up the characteristic of consciousness of identification. So those who believe in soul, human soul or any soul, the ability of that soul to identify with a body is taken up as a key characteristic of consciousness. Some bring in the concept of evolution to say that which evolves or that which propels evolution can be definitely called consciousness. Parapsychology brings in a very different idea of consciousness. It brings in the mystical or mysticism brings in a very different idea about consciousness, and it takes us very close to the spiritual Vedic idea of consciousness. And the idea is of there being a ground of consciousness, or there being a suffusion of consciousness that cuts across space and time in some mysterious ways through other dimensions or in some strange way that we don't know. It's the science of future that will tell us, but this is the mystical idea of it. And the mystical idea then is not only of the Vedic idea of there being a ground. So the Vedic idea would be there is a reality creating a principle for the universe, and each universe would have a principle. There are various principles, and the principle in turn creating the ground of a particular universe and elementals for that universe and fundamental beings for that universe, and also providing guidance to that universe. In this conceptualization, the idea of consciousness not only being consciousness force, but of being capable to be influenced by, almost manipulated by certain processes which are mystical and spiritual in nature. That whole idea comes in, and that brings in this whole idea of consciousness being a force. And this also takes us to the other points of consciousness undergoing rapid changes in the states of crisis. That there is a state element to the nature of consciousness, which we see very clearly in psychotherapy, that many schools of psychotherapy artificially create a crisis to facilitate transformation. And when we look at consciousness in its different manifestations, we see both uniqueness and commonality, both are characteristics. So these are some of the takes on what it is. The most comprehensive is of the Vedic idea of there being a reality or God, and then principle emanating from it for each universe, and that principle in turn creating fundamental elementals and fundamental deities. Sorry, I was talking about the comprehensive Vedic idea of reality, one principle for each universe. It's a multi-universe approach. The principle in turn creating fundamental entities and elementals, beings, forces, and guiding the overall journey of the universe. The idea of design, therefore, is inbuilt along with the idea of free will. And there, the mystery of consciousness is in the sense that it's a very universal and a very flexible entity which can take stations and become various things. And then the idea goes to that everything ultimately comes from consciousness. This idea also releases quite some opportunity for mysticism, spirituality, and an entire area of parapsychology. Now, what is the first mystery? The mystery is this. Regardless of how we conceptualize consciousness, the mystery of consciousness is this. It is the mystery of self-reflection. How far can an apparatus of knowing know itself? And there are two parts of it. One approach is a very Kantian approach to say that the knowing apparatus itself is constituted of elementals, and therefore beyond a point you cannot reflect upon those elementals that constitute the knowing apparatus. And the second way to put it is that the knowing apparatus has its own limitations in terms of self-reflection. Third way it's conceptualized is that this consciousness in its pursuit of development, as it develops, it gets into a state of oceanic experience. And in that oceanic experience, it's difficult to know anything in the way we scientifically know in ordinary consciousness. And therefore, there are states of this consciousness where the function of knowing is not as fluid, as lucid, and therefore there is a limitation of it. Yet another way to look at it is that this consciousness is not independent of the apparatus it uses, and the apparatus it uses of the sensory and the conceptual type and the cognitive type puts a limit on how it is. Another way to look at it is that the self-reflection is also limited by the physical body in which the consciousness finds itself. And this brings out the element of the unknowable and the element of the unconscious. And this deepens the mystery because in one sense, it tells us that consciousness that has become everything is not capable of knowing itself in certain ways when it configures itself. And this also brings us two ideas, the unknowable of Kant and the unconscious of Freud. In both cases, consciousness, although trying to know, fails to know because of the very nature of the configuration of reality it encounters. And the irony is, this configuration of reality is of its own creation in one way. The mystery takes another shape and color when we talk of the transpersonal. And this starts from the collective unconscious of Jung, the intergenerational transmission that we learn from animal behavior, and the deep innate structures of language that we see in linguistics. And this transpersonal nature, and also we see the outcomes of evolution, which are also transpersonal. Often we forget that evolution is essentially a transpersonal theory. And this gives another color and flavor to consciousness of the play between consciousness as it manifests in the individual and the transpersonal element it carries with itself, and the transpersonal nature of the broad phenomena of evolution in which consciousness evolves through. And this brings us to another mysterious thing of consciousness, the stations of consciousness. That consciousness not only devolves and involves itself from inanimate to the most conscious, but even in the most conscious, that is human beings, or maybe better creatures we don't know of, there are stations of consciousness, and in the developmental cycle, we see various stations of consciousness. It's like mapping out the various states that one goes into in the developmental journey. Sri Aurobindo has mapped it out elaborately. And then we get into rare states, which deepens the mystery. And one of the rare states is the state of enlightenment. As I said before, it's a category word for the state of pure awareness, or the state of nirvana, or the state of stillness without thought, or the state of no thought and bliss, or the state of oceanic experience of the samadhi. And this separates the experience of consciousness from thought and feeling. Usually it is entangled. Consciousness is entangled with thoughts and feelings, as though thoughts and feelings, unless they are there, consciousness is not there. But it's not true. In the state of enlightenment, we clearly see that thoughts and feelings are specific events that happen with consciousness, but that they are not consciousness themselves. You can be in a state of no thought, no affect, and yet be in a state of awareness and in the state of bliss. So that gives a very different nature to the mystery of consciousness, because it is no more I think, therefore I am. And lastly, it talks about evolution of consciousness, which is one theory of history, that the opposite end of Marxism. So if Marx talks about a material determinism of history, this talks about the consciousness evolution in history. And this gives a very different flavor to the mystery of consciousness, because then it is all around us in a very concrete way, manifesting itself, and yet being so mysterious and elusive. Heidegger says it's too near to be found. It's not only near, it is itself finding itself. Thank you.